A quiet hero's morning. The early morning light stretched across the small town of Cedar Glen like a blanket of golden warmth. The trees lining the streets were still bathed in the soft glow of dawn, their shadows long and graceful as the sun climbed higher in the sky. In his modest home on Maple Street, Howard Miller, a man of 85 years, was beginning his day. Howard's life, for all intents and purposes, was the epitome of simplicity. He had lived in Cedar Glen for over 70 years, long enough to know every face on his street, every name, and every family history. He had witnessed the ebb and flow of time, the births and deaths, the rise and fall of businesses, the changes in the faces of the younger generation, and the long-fading memories of the old. But throughout it all, one thing remained constant: Howard's commitment to living life on his own terms. As he stepped out the front door of his home, his gait was slow, yet measured, a reflection of the care he took in every step. The cane he carried, an elegant wooden piece with brass inlays, was more than just a walking aid, it was a symbol of strength. His daughter, Laura, had insisted that he use it after a minor fall the previous winter. He didn't need it, not really. His legs, though a bit slower now, were still strong, and he had walked on his own 2 feet for a lifetime. But the cane was a concession to his daughter's worry, and to his own desire to keep her mind at ease. The first part of Howard's morning routine was a solitary one, yet deeply meaningful. Every day, rain or shine, he raised the American flag that flew proudly in his front yard. His hands, weathered from years of hard work and military service, moved with practiced precision as he pulled the rope, hoisting the stars and stripes up against the cool morning sky. The ritual was a private tribute to the comrades he had lost during World War II, many of whom would never return to the shores they had left behind. Howard's chest swelled with pride as the flag fluttered in the breeze, a silent testimony to the sacrifices made by so many. He often found himself silently whispering the names of his fallen friends as he completed the task, feeling their presence alongside him. His attire was always the same: dark green cardigan, khaki pants, and polished brown shoes that gleamed in the morning sunlight. It wasn't that he cared much for appearances, rather, the act of shining his shoes was a ritual passed down to him from his Navy days, a habit that kept him grounded in discipline. Every Sunday evening, no matter how tired he was, Howard would polish his shoes, a small act of remembrance for the strict regimen that had shaped him into the man he had become. Evelyn, his late wife of 40 years, had teased him about it, joking that he had never stopped marching. But she had also bought him those shoes, and the memory of her smile as she did so stayed with him as he tended to this small but important part of his life. After the flag had been raised and his shoes were shining, Howard's next stop was always the garden. Gardening had been a passion of his long before he met Evelyn, but it had become even more so after she passed away 7 years ago. Their garden had been something they had both nurtured together, and now it was Howard's solitary retreat. The roses, in particular, were his pride and joy. He'd planted them when they first moved into the house, and over the years, they had become a symbol of their love and the life they had shared. The rose bushes required constant care, and Howard found a deep sense of purpose in tending to them. There was something therapeutic about watching the delicate blooms unfold, about witnessing life spring forth from the earth, even when the world seemed to be filled with loss and sorrow. For Howard, the garden had become more than just a hobby, it was a place to remember, a place to heal. He knelt carefully, his knees creaking as he adjusted his gardening gloves, worn thin but still holding the imprint of Evelyn's hands. She had given him those gloves on their 40th anniversary, teasing him that now he could finally stop coming inside with scratches on his hands. The gloves, though patched and faded, had never been replaced. They were a reminder of the life they had built together and the care they had shared in their quiet, daily rituals. As Howard worked among the roses, his thoughts naturally drifted to the past. The war. His time in the Pacific. He had been just 19 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and like so many others, he had enlisted immediately, eager to serve his country. The days that followed had been filled with horrors and sacrifices, but there were moments, too, that stood out, small pockets of peace that had allowed him to find respite in the chaos. One such moment had occurred on a small island where Howard's unit had been stationed. Amid the tension and fear of battle, he had spent quiet hours helping the local villagers tend to their gardens, finding solace in the rhythm of planting, pruning, and harvesting. It was there, in the midst of the Pacific's brutality, that Howard had learned a valuable lesson: life, no matter how difficult, always had the potential to bloom again. And that lesson, taught to him under the tropical sun, was one he carried with him for the rest of his life. Even now, in his small garden, he could see the beauty of that truth reflected in the delicate roses that had grown under his care. A car horn broke him from his reverie. Howard turned, lifting his hand in greeting to Amy, the young girl who lived next door. She was riding her bike down the street, her face bright with the energy of youth. Howard had known Amy since she was a toddler, and in many ways, she reminded him of the children he never had. His daughter, Laura, had struggled with fertility, and though Howard loved her deeply, he sometimes wished he had been blessed with grandchildren of his own. But Amy and the other children in the neighborhood had become his family of sorts. They called him Grandpa Howard, and he loved them as if they were his own. Amy had helped him plant tulip bulbs last fall, and every time the flowers bloomed, he was reminded of her kindness. He waved at her as she rode by, smiling as she called out, "Good morning, Mr. Miller." Howard felt a warmth in his heart as he watched her disappear down the street. It was small moments like this that gave his life meaning, moments of connection, of shared history, and of a love that transcended bloodlines. These were the things that made Cedar Glen feel like home, and they were the things that kept him going, year after year, even as his body slowed and the world around him seemed to change faster than he could keep up. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Howard stood up from his garden, stretching his back and wiping the sweat from his brow. He was content. But little did he know, his quiet, peaceful life was about to be shattered in ways he never could have imagined. It would all begin with a chance encounter, an encounter that would push Howard to the limits of his patience, his strength, and his resolve. The shadows of his past were about to collide with the present, and Howard would find himself in a fight for not only his own dignity, but for the future of Cedar Glen itself. And as the day unfolded, Howard had no idea that the simple, everyday routine he had followed for decades would soon become the battlefield on which he would fight one of the most important battles of his life. A growing storm. As Howard stood in his garden, feeling the weight of the morning sun against his back, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in the world around him. Cedar Glen, once a small, peaceful town where neighbors knew one another and waved from their porches, had started to feel different. The bustling streets of downtown were now dotted with businesses that had come and gone, many replaced by new, unfamiliar faces. The town was growing, and with that growth, came the inevitable shifts in the way people treated one another. Howard had seen it all: wars, civil rights struggles, economic recessions, and the birth of new technology that changed the very fabric of society. But Cedar Glen had always been a place where people respected one another, where shared history held weight, and where kindness was never in short supply. Or so it had seemed, at least to him. The tranquility of his daily life had never been interrupted until a few weeks ago. A group of bikers had rolled into town, their motorcycles roaring through the streets in a way that made heads turn and hearts skip a beat. Howard had noticed them the first time they rode past his house, their loud engines and leather-clad figures stark against the quiet backdrop of Cedar Glen. They seemed to be a regular fixture now, showing up in the early mornings and late afternoons, speeding past the local cafe, hanging out at the convenience store, or congregating at the park. At first, Howard didn't think much of it. He'd lived through enough tumult to know that people came and went, and as long as they weren't causing trouble, he could live with the noise. But something about this group felt different. Their bikes were a sharp contrast to the old trucks and sedans that had typically driven down the street. Their tattoos, their scowls, and their unpredictable behavior all carried a certain tension that unsettled Howard. He noticed how they treated the locals. A few weeks ago, they had crowded into a diner, knocking over chairs, making rude comments, and laughing at the discomfort they caused. The waitress, a young woman who was a local to Cedar Glen, had been visibly shaken by the way they'd treated her. And then there was the time they'd cornered a teenager in the park, taunting him and throwing empty beer cans at him. Howard had seen it from his porch, and though his instincts told him to step in, he'd hesitated. He wasn't as spry as he used to be, and confronting a group of bikers could be dangerous. Instead, he had called the local sheriff's office, though the sheriff, a good man named Mark Harris, had been slow to act. Howard couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The peace he had worked so hard to maintain in his small corner of the world felt as though it was slipping through his fingers. Cedar Glen was beginning to feel like a place where the old values he held dear, the ones of respect, kindness, and the understanding of each other's struggles, were being replaced by something much darker. As he worked in the garden, Howard heard the familiar sound of motorcycles revving in the distance. He looked up, squinting against the bright sunlight. Sure enough, the bikers were approaching. There were 5 of them today, riding in formation as they sped past his house, the roar of their engines making the windows rattle. He watched them for a moment, his fingers still gripped around the shears, the memories of his time in the Navy suddenly rushing back to him. His training, his discipline, the years spent in places far from home where danger was a constant companion, all seemed to flicker in his mind. This wasn't the world he had fought for. This wasn't the peaceful existence he had come back to after the war. Cedar Glen had always been a place where people looked out for one another, a place where everyone respected the values of hard work, kindness, and neighborly love. But now, these bikers seemed to be testing those values, pushing against the boundaries of what the community had always stood for. As the motorcycles continued down the road, Howard could see them slow down. The group of bikers, led by a man with a bald head and a thick, grimy beard, circled back toward the local cafe. Howard had been there just last week, enjoying a cup of coffee and reading the morning paper. It was a quiet place, a safe haven for the older residents of the town, where they could meet for breakfast or lunch and chat about the good old days. But today, as the bikers rolled into the parking lot, Howard's stomach turned. He knew what was about to happen. The bikers dismounted their motorcycles with a swagger, their leather jackets creaking as they stretched. Their leader, the man Howard had seen before, had a menacing air about him. He had the look of someone who enjoyed stirring up trouble, someone who thrived on intimidation. As they approached the cafe, Howard could see the older couple sitting at a booth by the window, their faces full of discomfort as the bikers made their entrance. The group was loud, obnoxious, and demanding. Howard could see them already starting to get under the skin of the cafe staff. He didn't know why he felt compelled to act, but he did. Howard knew that it wasn't right for the peace of Cedar Glen to be disrupted, not by these bullies. He couldn't stand by and let them tear apart the tranquility that he had fought so hard for, especially not in front of people who had no way of defending themselves. He gripped his cane a little tighter, suddenly feeling a sense of urgency. Maybe I'm getting too old for this, Howard muttered under his breath as he made his way toward the front door. He had no idea what he was going to do once he reached the cafe. He wasn't looking for a fight. But he wasn't about to let these punks push people around in his town. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Howard entered, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. The bikers had already taken up space at the counter, their voices loud and grating. The waitress behind the counter was doing her best to ignore their jeers, though it was clear she was rattled. A few customers, who had been enjoying their meals in peace, now seemed to shrink into their seats, glancing nervously at the bikers. Howard's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. He wasn't the type to make a scene. He never had been. But his mind flashed to the time he spent in the Pacific, to the brothers he had lost, to the values he had sworn to uphold, and to the family and community he had built here in Cedar Glen. These bikers may have thought they could intimidate anyone, but they didn't know the kind of man they were dealing with. "Excuse me," Howard's voice was calm, yet firm, as he approached the group at the counter. The bikers turned to face him, their faces momentarily showing confusion before a smirk crept onto the leader's lips. The man with the thick beard stepped forward, sizing Howard up. "What's this old man want?" the biker sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "I think it's time you all leave," Howard said, his voice unwavering. The bikers laughed, as if they hadn't taken him seriously. "You think you're gonna make us?" the leader asked, clearly unimpressed. Howard's grip tightened on his cane, and for the first time in a long while, his military training kicked in. The calm demeanor he had adopted over the years wasn't the only side of him. He had fought in wars, faced down enemies far more dangerous than these punks. And the values he held dear were not just for show, they were hard-earned. Before anyone could react, Howard picked up the pace, his cane moving like an extension of his body, a precise tool in his hands. The bikers were caught off guard by his sudden shift in demeanor, and before they could escalate things further, Howard had positioned himself between them and the counter. There would be no more bullying in his town. "Leave," Howard repeated, his voice commanding. The bikers looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. But it was too late for them to back down. A storm was coming, and Howard Miller, 85 years old and a veteran of wars long past, wasn't about to let it tear apart the town he loved. The Battle of Wills. The tension in the cafe was palpable as Howard stood between the bikers and the counter, his eyes locked onto their leader. The bikers, accustomed to ruling over spaces with their intimidating presence, seemed momentarily thrown off by Howard's quiet resolve. The cafe had grown uncomfortably silent, save for the clinking of silverware and the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Howard's cane, once a simple tool for his arthritic joints, now seemed like a weapon in his hands, an extension of his unyielding will to protect the community he loved. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, the bravado that had initially radiated from them now flickering like a candle caught in the wind. Their leader, a burly man with tattoos that covered his arms and neck, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized Howard up. He was clearly not used to being confronted, especially not by someone so much older than him. "Old man, you got a death wish or something?" the leader sneered, his voice thick with condescension. His gang chuckled in unison, but the sound didn't quite reach their eyes. Howard could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. They weren't used to real resistance. Howard stood tall, though his posture was far from rigid. There was something about his quiet dignity that made the bikers hesitate. He wasn't the type of man who shouted or made a spectacle. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. "I've seen enough in my life to know what's right and what's wrong," Howard said, his voice measured and firm. "And right now, what you're doing isn't right. This town isn't for your games. Now, I suggest you leave. This is your last chance." The leader let out a low growl of frustration, clearly angered by Howard's calm demeanor. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lighting one with a flick of his Zippo lighter. "You think you can make us leave?" he asked, his eyes flicking over to his gang. "This is our town now, old man. You don't own this place. We do." Howard's hand tightened around his cane. He wasn't intimidated by the threats or the posturing. He had faced worse in his younger days, enemy soldiers who didn't hesitate to pull triggers, men who thought they could take away everything he held dear. But he had always found a way to survive. And today, Cedar Glen was no different. The door jingled open behind Howard, and he didn't have to look to know that Sheriff Mark Harris had arrived. The sheriff had been a good friend of Howard's for years, though he was often reluctant to take action unless the situation truly called for it. This was one of those times. Sheriff Harris stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the handle of his holstered sidearm. His eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the scene, Howard, standing firm, the bikers crowding the counter, the uncomfortable silence hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Is there a problem here, Howard?" Sheriff Harris asked, his voice calm, but the weight of his presence unmistakable. The bikers, seeing the sheriff, immediately stiffened. They weren't afraid of him exactly, but they knew enough about Cedar Glen's sheriff to understand that his presence meant things were about to get serious. Sheriff Harris had been around long enough to know when someone was trying to push boundaries, and he wasn't the kind of man to let it slide. "No problem, Mark," Howard replied, his voice still unwavering. "Just trying to get these fine gentlemen to take their business elsewhere. We don't need their kind here." The bikers laughed nervously, but their bravado was gone. They hadn't expected Howard to be this resolute, and they certainly hadn't expected the sheriff to be involved. The leader flicked his cigarette onto the floor and crushed it beneath his boot. "Look, we're just having a good time. We weren't hurting anybody." "You weren't hurting anybody?" Sheriff Harris repeated, his tone colder now. "You've been scaring the hell out of the locals, causing trouble wherever you go. You think that's just good fun?" The bikers looked uneasy, but the leader wasn't ready to back down. "It's a free country, Sheriff," he spat. "We're not doing anything illegal." Sheriff Harris took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the leader. "You're not doing anything illegal, huh? Let me tell you something, being a jerk isn't illegal, but it sure as hell isn't welcome in Cedar Glen. You've been making people uncomfortable, and that's not how we do things here." Howard stood by, watching the exchange with quiet approval. He'd known Sheriff Harris long enough to trust that he'd handle this with the right amount of firmness. But Howard also knew that sometimes, it wasn't enough to let others do the talking. He had been a soldier his whole life, and if there was one thing he had learned in his 85 years, it was that sometimes you had to stand up for what was right, even when others were hesitant. The bikers, sensing the rising tension and realizing they were no longer in control of the situation, exchanged uneasy looks. They weren't used to being talked down to, especially not by someone as old as Howard or a sheriff who wasn't afraid to challenge them. But they weren't completely ready to back off either. The leader puffed out his chest, trying to reassert dominance, but it was clear that his confidence was slipping. "Fine," he said finally, his voice sharp with frustration. "We'll leave, but don't think this is over, old man. We'll be back. This place is too small to hide in forever." Howard didn't flinch. "You do what you have to do, but don't think for a second you'll find anyone here afraid of you. Cedar Glen has always stood strong, and it always will." With that, the bikers turned and walked toward the door. Their departure was less dramatic than Howard had anticipated. There were no last-minute threats or exaggerated displays of strength. They simply left, leaving behind a lingering air of tension and frustration. Sheriff Harris watched them go, his posture still relaxed but his eyes hard. "You did good, Howard," he said quietly, once the door had closed behind them. "You handled that better than I could have." Howard smiled, but there was no trace of pride in his expression. "I didn't do it for myself, Mark. I did it for this town. We've been through too much to let anyone come in here and tear us apart." Sheriff Harris nodded, his expression softening. "I know, Howard. I know. And I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." As the sheriff left to return to his patrol car, Howard felt a deep sense of relief settle over him. He had stood up to the bikers, yes, but more importantly, he had stood up for the values that had defined his life: honor, community, and the courage to fight for what was right. It wasn't always easy, and it certainly wasn't always glamorous, but Howard knew this was how you protected what mattered most. The cafe patrons slowly began to return to their meals, their nervous glances giving way to whispered conversations. It was clear that the old man had done something powerful today. He had reminded them all that sometimes, the most powerful force in the world wasn't fear or aggression, but the quiet strength of someone who knew when to stand firm. As Howard turned to leave the cafe, he noticed the young waitress, who had been so shaken just a few moments before, give him a grateful smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a reminder that the fight for what's right, no matter how small the battle, was always worth it. Howard had fought for freedom once before, and he would do it again, for Cedar Glen and the people he loved. The call to action. The morning after the incident at the cafe, Howard Miller sat in his small living room, the walls lined with mementos from his long life. Photos of his time in the Navy, his service in World War II, and the life he had built after returning to Cedar Glen filled the room. The weight of each photo was more than just a memory, it was a testament to survival, perseverance, and community. Howard had always believed that there was a quiet strength in doing what was right, no matter the cost. But after the bikers' encounter, something inside him had changed. His desire to protect his town, his neighbors, and the life he had known for over 7 decades had shifted from an abstract notion to a clear, urgent calling. Cedar Glen had always been a place of peace, of small-town charm, and of unwavering decency. Howard had always been part of the fabric that held it together. But today, that fabric was threatened, and he couldn't just sit by and let it unravel. Sitting at his worn wooden desk, Howard pulled out his old military-issued phone book. It was yellowed with age, the edges fraying from years of use, but to him, it was a direct link to the people who had fought beside him, who understood what sacrifice and loyalty meant. His mind raced as he thought of the words he would need to say. His time was limited, at 85, every year counted. But his sharp mind and old instincts were still as clear as ever. If Cedar Glen was to survive the growing threat of outsiders like the bikers, it needed more than just a few stern words and the sheriff's occasional patrol. It needed unity. It needed action. With a slow but deliberate hand, Howard dialed the first number in his book, Captain James "Jimmy" Turner, a fellow veteran and former military leader who had gone on to become a successful businessman after the war. The phone rang twice before the line clicked and a familiar voice filled the receiver. "Hello. Jimmy, it's Howard," Howard said, his voice gravelly with age but firm in its purpose. "I need your help. Cedar Glen needs your help." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then the response came, steady and calm as ever. "What's going on, Howard? You don't sound like yourself." Howard leaned back in his chair, glancing out the window at the small, quiet town he had loved for so long. "We've got trouble. A gang of bikers came through here yesterday, causing trouble in the cafe, pushing people around. I don't think this is just a one-time thing. They're coming back, and I'm afraid this town isn't ready for what they'll do if we don't stop them now." There was a brief pause before Jimmy spoke again, his voice lower this time, more serious. "How bad is it?" "It's bad enough," Howard replied. "But I think we can stop them if we stand together. I know you have contacts, people who can help us. I need you to rally the men, the ones who fought in the war, the ones who still know how to stand tall and fight for what's right. Cedar Glen needs to see what true strength is." Jimmy's response was immediate. "I'll make some calls, Howard. I've still got a few men left from the old days. We may be older, but we're not out of the fight just yet." The connection was suddenly clear, and Howard could hear the resolution in Jimmy's voice. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he hung up the phone. This was the beginning of something more than just a stand against a gang. It was a rallying cry for a community that needed to remember its roots, a call to arms for men who had once fought for freedom on foreign soil but now had to defend the homes they had built. After making the call to Jimmy, Howard took a deep breath and dialed another number. This time, it was his daughter, Laura. He knew she would be worried about him, especially after the encounter with the bikers, but Howard needed her to understand. His responsibility to Cedar Glen wasn't just a matter of pride. It was about protecting the legacy of the place that had sheltered them all. "Hello, Dad. Is everything okay?" Laura's voice came through the receiver, warm with concern. "I'm fine, Laura. But I need to talk to you about something. You know what happened at the cafe yesterday?" "Of course. I heard. The sheriff told me about it," Laura replied, her voice tight with worry. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I'm not as fragile as you think," Howard chuckled softly. "But Cedar Glen isn't. These bikers aren't just passing through. They're here to stay, and they'll keep pushing as long as we let them. I'm going to call on some old friends, but I need you to do something for me. Laura hesitated, sensing the gravity in her father's tone. What do you need? I need you to help get the town together. We need to show these bikers that Cedar Glen won't back down. You're young, you're connected, and people will listen to you. Can you help me with that? There was a long pause on the other end, and Howard could almost hear the wheels turning in his daughter's mind. Finally, she spoke. Of course, Dad. I'll do whatever I can. You're right, this town needs to see that we're not weak. We won't let some bikers take over. Howard smiled. Laura had always been his anchor. When he lost Evelyn, his heart broke, but Laura had been there to remind him that the fight wasn't over. It was just a new chapter. Good. I'm proud of you, Laura. Now, I'll be in touch once I have a plan, but we need to move fast. If we don't act, Cedar Glen might never be the same again. As Howard set down the phone, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose stirring within him. The day before had been a wake-up call, one that had jolted him out of his routine and reminded him of the things that truly mattered. Cedar Glen had been built by people who fought for their homes and loved ones. It had been built on a foundation of pride, hard work, and unity. And now, it was time for that spirit to rise again. Howard spent the rest of the day making calls, connecting with old comrades, friends, and neighbors. One by one, he reached out to the men and women who had shaped Cedar Glen into the place it had always been, peaceful, tight-knit, and proud. There was no fanfare in his voice, no grand speeches. Just a simple message: it's time to stand together. The bikers might have underestimated them, but they would soon learn that Cedar Glen was a community that wouldn't break easily. By evening, Howard had gathered a small group of former military veterans, local business owners, and respected members of the community. Together, they would take a stand, not just against the bikers, but for the future of Cedar Glen. It wouldn't be easy, and the odds might be stacked against them, but Howard knew this was the only path forward. If they didn't fight for their town, no one else would. That night, as Howard sat on his porch, watching the sunset, he felt a renewed sense of peace. The coming battle would not be fought with violence or anger. It would be fought with courage, unity, and the strength of a community that refused to back down. Cedar Glen had been built on the backs of men and women who had given everything for their families, and now, it was their time to protect what was theirs. And Howard Miller, at 85 years old, was ready to lead the charge. The gathering storm. The days that followed Howard Miller's decision to rally the town felt like a whirlwind. The quiet streets of Cedar Glen were alive with whispers, plans, and a renewed sense of purpose. It was as though the town had awoken from a long, peaceful slumber, now ready to stand firm against the looming threat. Howard's calls had sparked something in the hearts of his neighbors, something fierce and unyielding. They were determined to protect their town, their homes, and the legacies of those who had built Cedar Glen from the ground up. Howard's first step was to meet with the group of men and women who had rallied to his cause. They gathered in a small community hall on the edge of town, a place where town meetings had been held for decades. The old wood floors creaked underfoot, and the smell of polished oak mixed with the scent of old papers and faded memories. There, Howard stood before a dozen or so familiar faces, veterans, local business owners, and respected citizens of Cedar Glen. He had never been one for grand speeches. But today, as he looked around the room, he knew that the strength of this group could move mountains. These were the people who had stood together through thick and thin, who had seen Cedar Glen rise from a quiet farming community to the peaceful town it was today. They were not going to let it fall into the hands of outsiders, no matter how intimidating. "Thank you all for coming," Howard began, his voice steady and strong, despite his age. "I won't waste your time with long speeches or promises. We all know what's at stake. This town, our home, has always been a place of peace. But peace requires vigilance. It requires standing up when others think they can push us around. And that's exactly what we're going to do. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. Each person was focused, their faces grim but resolute. We're not here to start a war. We're here to defend what's ours. Cedar Glen is not a playground for criminals. We're not a town of victims, we're a town of survivors. And if these bikers think they can just roll in and take what they want, they've got another thing coming. Howard's words hung in the air, thick with determination. He wasn't just speaking to the group in front of him. He was speaking to every resident of Cedar Glen, to the community that had shaped him into the man he was today. Laura, his daughter, stood beside him. Though she was younger and not as seasoned in the ways of confrontation as her father, she understood the gravity of the situation. She had spent the last few days working tirelessly to rally the town's support. And now, standing with her father, she could see the strength in the faces of the people around her. They were ready. We've got a plan, and it's simple, Howard continued. We're going to show these bikers that Cedar Glen is not a town to be messed with. We've got men who know how to fight, women who know how to protect their families, and neighbors who will stand side by side with us. Together, we'll make it clear that Cedar Glen belongs to the people who built it, not to outsiders who think they can intimidate us. The group nodded in agreement. There was no question that the bikers had underestimated Cedar Glen, and now, the time had come to make that clear. As the meeting progressed, Howard and the group worked out the details of their plan. They didn't have much time, and the bikers were likely to return soon, emboldened by their earlier success. They needed to act quickly, but they also needed to be strategic. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage. The plan was simple but effective. First, they would focus on securing the most vulnerable spots in town, starting with the Riverside Cafe, where the bikers had caused the most damage. They would make it clear to the cafe owners that they had the town's full support and that any trouble would not be tolerated. Then, they would reach out to other local businesses, including the gas station and the grocery store, ensuring that everyone knew they weren't alone. Cedar Glen's strength was in its unity, and Howard knew that if they could stand together, the bikers wouldn't stand a chance. But they also needed to prepare for the possibility of a confrontation. They weren't looking for violence, but they couldn't afford to be naive. The bikers weren't there to make peace, they were there to cause chaos. So, Howard's group would be ready, armed with nothing more than their experience, their courage, and their unshakable belief in what they were defending. We'll keep it quiet for now, Howard said as the meeting began to wind down. No need to stir up panic, but we need to make sure everyone is on the same page. We'll move fast, and we'll move together. Laura gave her father a small, reassuring smile. She could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to enlist in the Navy at the age of 19, the same fire that had kept him going through the years after the war. He wasn't just fighting for Cedar Glen, he was fighting for every person who had ever called this town home. As the meeting ended, the group dispersed, each person leaving with a sense of purpose. They had a task ahead of them, and they were determined to see it through. But Howard knew that this was just the beginning. The hard part was still to come. The bikers had no idea what they were about to face. Cedar Glen wasn't just a quiet little town. It was a community of strong, resilient people who would stand united in the face of any threat. That evening, Howard returned to his home, his mind racing with thoughts of the coming days. He could feel the weight of his years, but he also felt the strength of the memories that had shaped him. The friends he had lost in the war, the family he had built, the town he had watched grow, it was all part of him, and he was ready to defend it with everything he had. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm, golden light, Howard stood on his porch, gazing out over the streets he had known his entire life. Cedar Glen was more than just a town to him. It was a reflection of everything he had fought for, everything he had loved. And now, it was his turn to protect it. He gripped his cane tightly, his resolve hardening. Whatever the bikers had planned, they would find out quickly that Cedar Glen wasn't the kind of place where bullies thrived. In this town, the strong defended the weak, and the old fought alongside the young. It didn't matter how old he was. Howard Miller wasn't done fighting yet. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, weathered notebook. It was full of names and numbers, old friends, allies, veterans, and neighbors. He had already made some calls, but there were more to be made. More to rally. More to prepare. The storm was coming, but Cedar Glen was ready. And Howard Miller, at 85 years old, would lead them into battle once again. The final stand. The days leading up to the bikers' return to Cedar Glen were tense, but Howard Miller could feel a shift in the air. It wasn't just the weather, though the late summer had brought with it a dry heat, the town itself seemed to simmer with anticipation. The streets, usually quiet and easygoing, now held a sense of solidarity. Howard's phone rang constantly. He had spoken to dozens of residents, all of them promising their full support. Some had offered to help out with physical defense, others had contributed in ways that were more subtle but equally vital, spreading the word, watching for any signs of the bikers returning, keeping an eye out for strangers passing through. Every single person in Cedar Glen seemed to be involved, from the local schoolteacher to the owners of the hardware store. Howard sat in his old, worn recliner that evening, his cane resting against the chair's arm. His daughter, Laura, was busy in the kitchen, preparing a meal for them both, though Howard wasn't very hungry. He'd never been able to eat much in the past few days, too caught up in thoughts of what was coming. Every so often, the doorbell would ring, and Laura would answer, letting in another member of the town who had something to offer, or someone simply seeking reassurance. "You're not going to do this alone, Dad," Laura had said to him earlier in the week when he first broached the idea of facing the bikers head-on. "We're all in this together." Howard hadn't been sure what to make of that at first. It was one thing to stand up to a few troublemakers, it was another thing to prepare an entire town to face down a group of men who didn't seem to fear anything. But his daughter's words stayed with him. They were together. And as the sun began to set on the horizon that evening, he knew that this would be the turning point, not just for Cedar Glen, but for him personally. The bikers, a group of hard-eyed men clad in black leather and tattoos, had made their way through Cedar Glen once before, but this time they would find a much different reception. Howard had put the call out to his old friends, the veterans he had served with in the Navy, men who had seen war and lived to tell the tale. The old alliances formed during difficult times had held strong, and now they were standing at Howard's side. Every phone call, every plan, had led to this moment. Cedar Glen had transformed from a quiet, sleepy town into a fortress built on unity, resolve, and the unshakable will of its people. The following day, as the early morning fog began to lift and the sun broke through the haze, Howard made his way to the community hall once more. It was a pivotal day, one that would decide the fate of Cedar Glen, at least for the moment. He had gathered the veterans, the farmers, the shop owners, and even the town's teachers, all of whom had pledged their allegiance to the cause. The plan was clear, the bikers would arrive, expecting a town unprepared, a town ripe for the taking. But what they would find would be very different. Cedar Glen was not a town to be intimidated. It wasn't just Howard who stood in their way, it was every person who called this place home. Howard's mind wandered briefly as he walked, the cool air brushing against his weathered face. He thought of Evelyn, his late wife, the love of his life. She had always been there, at his side, urging him to stand strong in the face of adversity. She had never backed down from a fight, and neither would he. Even now, he could almost hear her voice, as clear as the day they first met. "You've always known what's right, Howard. You've always done the right thing. You stand up for what matters." And so, Howard had always stood. But now, it was not just for his own peace of mind or for his family's future, it was for the future of Cedar Glen. As he reached the community hall, the town's makeshift headquarters for the defense effort, he found his friends already waiting for him. Bob, a retired police officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, Tom, the local mechanic who had spent years keeping the town's cars running, and George, the farmer who had always been the first to lend a hand, stood in the front of the room. Their faces were set with the same determination that Howard had come to rely on throughout his life. "You ready for this, Howard?" Bob asked, his voice deep and steady, as though he were ready to face any challenge, no matter the odds. Howard nodded. "I've been ready for a long time, Bob. Now it's time to show them what Cedar Glen is made of." The group went over the plan once more. They would spread out, covering key areas of the town. Each of the townspeople who had volunteered would be stationed at strategic points, prepared to keep an eye out for the bikers and deter them if necessary. The goal wasn't to escalate the situation into a violent confrontation, it was to make it clear that Cedar Glen wouldn't tolerate anyone trying to take advantage of its peaceful reputation. Howard knew that the bikers wouldn't expect any resistance. They might be tough, but they weren't prepared for a town of people who had lived through wars, lived through hardship, and still stood strong. Howard's military training had never left him. He had learned the importance of strategy, of keeping calm under pressure. And now, all that experience was going to be put to the test. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Howard returned to his home. He sat at his kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him. Laura placed a plate of food in front of him, but he barely touched it. "You okay?" Laura asked gently, her eyes full of concern. Howard looked up at his daughter and smiled faintly. "I'm just thinking about all the years gone by, Laura. About everything that brought me here." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but he quickly cleared his throat. "I know you and the others are all in this together, but I need you to promise me one thing. If it comes to a fight, don't go in blindly. You take care of yourselves. That's all I ask." Laura nodded solemnly. "I promise, Dad." That evening, Howard retired early, though sleep did not come easily. The town was quiet, and the sounds of crickets outside his window did little to calm his mind. He knew the bikers would be close by. It wasn't their first time in town, and it wouldn't be their last unless someone stood up to them. Howard hadn't been sure what to make of that at first. It was one thing to stand up to a few troublemakers, it was another thing to prepare an entire town to face down a group of men who didn't seem to fear anything. But his daughter's words stayed with him. They were together. And as the sun began to set on the horizon that evening, he knew that this would be the turning point, not just for Cedar Glen, but for him personally. The bikers, a group of hard-eyed men clad in black leather and tattoos, had made their way through Cedar Glen once before, but this time they would find a much different reception. Howard had put the call out to his old friends, the veterans he had served with in the Navy, men who had seen war and lived to tell the tale. The old alliances formed during difficult times had held strong, and now they were standing at Howard's side. Every phone call, every plan, had led to this moment. Cedar Glen had transformed from a quiet, sleepy town into a fortress built on unity, resolve, and the unshakable will of its people. The following day, as the early morning fog began to lift and the sun broke through the haze, Howard made his way to the community hall once more. It was a pivotal day, one that would decide the fate of Cedar Glen, at least for the moment. He had gathered the veterans, the farmers, the shop owners, and even the town's teachers, all of whom had pledged their allegiance to the cause. The plan was clear, the bikers would arrive, expecting a town unprepared, a town ripe for the taking. But what they would find would be very different. Cedar Glen was not a town to be intimidated. It wasn't just Howard who stood in their way, it was every person who called this place home. Howard's mind wandered briefly as he walked, the cool air brushing against his weathered face. He thought of Evelyn, his late wife, the love of his life. She had always been there, at his side, urging him to stand strong in the face of adversity. She had never backed down from a fight, and neither would he. Even now, he could almost hear her voice, as clear as the day they first met. "You've always known what's right, Howard. You've always done the right thing. You stand up for what matters. And so, Howard had always stood. But now, it was not just for his own peace of mind or for his family's future, it was for the future of Cedar Glen. As he reached the community hall, the town's makeshift headquarters for the defense effort, he found his friends already waiting for him. Bob, a retired police officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, Tom, the local mechanic who had spent years keeping the town's cars running, and George, the farmer who had always been the first to lend a hand, stood in the front of the room. Their faces were set with the same determination that Howard had come to rely on throughout his life. "You ready for this, Howard?" Bob asked, his voice deep and steady, as though he were ready to face any challenge, no matter the odds. Howard nodded. "I've been ready for a long time, Bob. Now it's time to show them what Cedar Glen is made of." The group went over the plan once more. They would spread out, covering key areas of the town. Each of the townspeople who had volunteered would be stationed at strategic points, prepared to keep an eye out for the bikers and deter them if necessary. The goal wasn't to escalate the situation into a violent confrontation, it was to make it clear that Cedar Glen wouldn't tolerate anyone trying to take advantage of its peaceful reputation. Howard knew that the bikers wouldn't expect any resistance. They might be tough, but they weren't prepared for a town of people who had lived through wars, lived through hardship, and still stood strong. Howard's military training had never left him. He had learned the importance of strategy, of keeping calm under pressure. And now, all that experience was going to be put to the test. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Howard returned to his home. He sat at his kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him. Laura placed a plate of food in front of him, but he barely touched it. "You okay?" Laura asked gently, her eyes full of concern. Howard looked up at his daughter and smiled faintly. "I'm just thinking about all the years gone by, Laura. About everything that brought me here." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but he quickly cleared his throat. "I know you and the others are all in this together, but I need you to promise me one thing. If it comes to a fight, don't go in blindly. You take care of yourselves. That's all I ask." Laura nodded solemnly. "I promise, Dad." That evening, Howard retired early, though sleep did not come easily. The town was quiet, and the sounds of crickets outside his window did little to calm his mind. He knew the bikers would be close by. It wasn't their first time in town, and it wouldn't be their last unless someone stood up to them.